So bringing it home to action and where we go from here. How do you change ecosystems, make real system level change through all this? And I have the honor and the fun of introducing Jonathan Gruber, professor at MIT Economics, who many of you know has been deeply engaged in health economic policy and incentives and how one might design healthcare systems in the US to be more equitable and inclusive, as well as affordable across everything. So Jonathan will give us a little bit of his insights and ideas about health economics and where we're going from here. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. So it's good to be here. My talk is titled "The Politics," but I get in trouble when I talk about politics. So I'm going to talk about economics, but I'm happy to answer your questions about politics after I'll talk for about 15, 20 minutes. Then I'm happy to answer your questions about the current political climate, everything going on. So I have good news and bad news. The good news that you've talked about a lot and that you all know is we're sort of really on the verge of a genetic revolution in pharmaceuticals and healthcare treatment more generally. That's very exciting because we'll be able to treat disease in a more targeted and effective way than we ever have before. And personalized medicine holds out an enormous amount of promise for more effectively delivering care to individuals. The bad news is it's going to be really, really expensive. And the benefits, broadly speaking, the benefits of targeting care are highly unlikely to outweigh the extra costs of developing the targeted drugs. There's no free lunch here. That we're going to make people healthier with personalized medicine at a higher cost. It's not like personalized medicine is going to somehow save money by targeting better and that's not going to make this a net savings. It's going to cost money. So what I want to talk about today is two things about how an economist thinks about this genetic revolution in drug development. And I want to talk about what it means for the insurance market and for reimbursement of pharmaceuticals. So let's talk about the insurance market, because it is critical to think about the insurance market implications of moving towards personalized medicine and moving towards more genetic targeting of disease and understanding how we target medications to individuals. This is actually a very well-timed example because the person who developed this insight most profoundly was an economist named Ken Arrow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who passed away recently. And Ken Arrow was one of his great giant contributions in economics was coming to a world where economists always said, look, more is better, and one of the things more is better is information. More information is better, more information makes the world work better. And Arrow said, well, let's pose the following example. Imagine that you have two islands in the middle of the ocean, and there's a farmer on each of them, and they live off what they make on the farm. And imagine that they know with certainty one of the islands will be wiped out by a hurricane, but they don't know which one. Well, in that world, what will happen naturally is the farmers will get together and insure each other. They'll say, look, I don't want to be the one who's devastated by this, so we're going to insure each other. We'll say, look, whichever island gets wiped out, the other one will come in and help it out. And that way we'll protect against the downside of starving to death because your island got wiped out. Now let's say the government comes along and provides a great weather technology which says, no, it's this island that's getting wiped out. What happens? Well, the other farmer says, see ya, sorry for you, you're gone. Life is worse, not better, with more information. Okay? This is a parable about how more information in the world of insurance markets, effectively, if you think about it, better and better genetic marking is the end of insurance. What does insurance mean when we're born knowing everything that's going to go wrong with us? Okay? You can't have insurance. Okay? So basically what that means is essentially that if we bring us back to the current discussion over health insurance, the bottom line is we have to have insurance pooling. You can't allow discriminatory insurance markets because there's more and more information on which to discriminate. Essentially, more information means more of a need for pooled insurance and not experience-rated insurance where everybody's insured based on their own characteristics. Or essentially, it's just going to break down and the sick will end up just being unable to pay their bills. The bottom line is we have a highly skewed distribution of medical spending. 80% of our medical spending is done by 20% of our individuals. That's a basic law in most countries. Okay, about 8% of spending is done by 20% of the people. Those 20% of the people cannot afford to spend the 80%. So in a world we know exactly when people are born who the 20% are, either we share the risk or they die. And that's the trade-off. And the question is just simply how we're going to share the risk. And there's many ways of sharing the risk. But ultimately, they involve not allowing insurers to discriminate between the sick and the healthy. And that's sort of the main goal of the Affordable Care Act. If you think of the Affordable Care Act, does a lot of things. The fundamental, most important goal is ending insurance market discrimination. And really, a lot of what it does follows from that. The mandate is necessary to end, because you can't end insurance market discrimination without everybody participating. The tax credits are necessary because you can't have the mandate if people can't afford insurance. It all follows from there. But really, the underlying principle is this notion of insurance pooling. Okay? So in terms of, it's clear that as we develop more genetic information, more personalized medicine, we need more pooled insurance. And so stepping back from the Affordable Care Act is exactly the wrong direction to be going right now as we move forward. We need to move towards more pooling of risk, not less. But that's not the only issue we have to worry about. Even if everyone's insured, we have another issue, which is how do you actually insure specialty drugs? How do you actually, even if everyone has insurance, how do you think about insuring? So the basic trade-off is the less well-covered a drug is, okay, the less we're sharing the risk people face of having the disease that drug helps with. But the more well-covered a drug is, the more people might overuse the drug and use it more than necessary because it's free. And in particular, the less consumers are engaged in shopping for more cost-effective alternatives. So essentially, as we want to think about coverage of drugs, really the key thing is, what are the alternatives? And the more alternatives there are, the more we want to use price incentives to get people to shop for those cost-effective alternatives. Okay? So basically, the problem is with specialty drugs, there are no alternatives. So in a specialty patented drug that's still on patent, there really is no other place to go. So we can't really use consumer cost sharing to solve the problem. If you're talking about diabetes drugs or other things with its generic alternatives, you can use complicated cost-sharing structures to try to get people to shift to the low-cost drug. You can't do that for a high-cost specialty drug. So as these new personalized targeted drugs come in, consumer engagement is not going to be the way to get costs down. There's going to be no engagement. There's just one drug to take, and you take it, and it's $1 million a year. Okay? So what that means is we can't avoid the other side of the coin, which is dealing with reimbursement issues. We can't use the notion of consumer engagement to control the cost of specialty drugs. We need to do that on the reimbursement side. Now, that raises the question of how do we reimburse? And thinking about how we reimburse from an economist's perspective raises 4 separate issues that we have to deal with. The first is substitution. How well do new treatments substitute for old treatments? How distinct are the new treatments? That's issue 1. The second is cost effectiveness, which is new treatments with very different prices can have very similar effects on health. The third issue is targeting, which is that a drug which may be very cost-effective, very narrowly targeted population may not be cost-effective as that population gets larger. Okay? And the final issue is the fixed cost of development. And the reason, and this third and fourth issues are really tricky when we put them together, because the fixed cost of development means you want as broad a possible audience, but the broadest audience as possible. But the benefits of targeting means you want as narrow an audience as possible. And those things are in tension. So how do we resolve these issues? So the clear answer, in theory, we have a clear answer, which is we simply define what is the most cost-effective path to the outcome we want to get to. Okay? And we set up a system which incents people to follow that path, and we reimburse according to the least cost path to get there. So for example, let's think about knee replacement. Okay? So knee replacement is something that should be done in many places fairly effectively. So what CalPERS did, they're the public insurer for California, what they did for reimbursing knee replacement is they said to individuals, we will pay the cost of replacing your knee at the lowest cost hospital in your area. You can go there, it's free. You go anywhere else, you pay the difference. So that's sort of one way to try to use those tools to do it. But that's hard when you have a super expensive specialty drug. You can't really do that, like I said, because there's just one route to go. So you define that route, so then we have no choice but to ask, what are we willing to pay for that drug? And that is the tricky part economically. Economically, we sort of know the answer, which is we put a value on a life year, and we pay depending how many life years it saves. Politically, that's hard to do. And that's going to be sort of the number one challenge we're going to face as we go forward with more specialty drugs is how do we actually take the kind of cost effectiveness calculations that are being done all the time and actually put them into the political process is the enormous challenge. Okay? Then finally, we have the issue of how you finance the research, which is we don't want people using drugs which are very effective on one kind of cancer. We don't use it in other kinds of cancer. That could become ineffective. But drug companies have all the incentives to do that. So the question is, to what extent can we reduce those incentives by socializing drug development research? To what extent can we try to offload some of the costs of research in a way which reduce the incentive of the drug companies to try to create the broadest possible market, when in fact they've got a drug that really should work most effectively for a narrow targeted indication? Okay? So we have models here, models like, for example, models where you pre-commit, governments pre-commit to buy a certain amount at a certain amount of money to try to get the drug company to develop a drug. But really, in some sense, I think the fundamental challenge facing us is the public versus private R&D conundrum, which is we put a lot of money into NIH, $30 billion a year. That does a lot of good in providing public resources for drug development. But those public resources aren't priced, they're free. Drug companies use them, but they still have the incentive to try to develop the biggest possible market. So how do we, I think the tension economically is how do we recognize that drugs should be really narrow targeted and can do wonderful things if they are, but that's going to make it, there's going to be less incentive to develop a narrowly targeted drug, and I think that's a difficult point we face. So basically, I think at the end of the day, the point I'm trying to make is it all comes back to how much you want to socialize these issues. That we can't just count on the private market to fix these issues. The private market can't fix the issue of insurance because ultimately insurers have every incentive to discriminate. We just socialize insurance, at least through risk pooling rules. And we need to think about how much we're willing to socialize drug development and what the role of the public sector is going to be in trying to finance development when drugs are on a very, very targeted basis. So that's just some initial thoughts I want to start with. Now, I can talk forever. I like to say people should pay me to not talk, not pay me to talk. But don't tell anybody that, because I like getting paid to talk. But if folks have questions about what I've mentioned, or I'm happy to talk about the current political context as it relates to health reform, et cetera, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But I thought I'd leave more time for conversation if folks had questions or thoughts. No, don't clap yet. Don't clap yet. I'm not done. Let's see how I do on the questions. So fire away. What do people want to talk about? Yeah, go ahead, chap.
By the way, Dave Russo says hello. I do pastoral care work. I work with a lot of elderly. They're like walking money machines to the doctors, and many of the people just want to die as they speak with me. I don't understand how we have a culture that really knows this, and yet at the same time, we continue to fund that 80% towards some of these treatments or some of these cost venues where we really could do something about this. And I think maybe I don't know. I'll ask the question about my point that I'm making with regards to that getting older and how, the endeavor around that. And again, thinking about the socialization aspect of leaving a debt for all of the youngsters to follow.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would view sort of the number one issue you're raising as kind of, what about all this money we spend on people at the end of their life, is sort of what you're pointing out. Well, that's a great example because it's first of all, it's not as big dollars as you think. It's about a sixth of Medicare spending. So it's like 2% of Medicare, it's like 2 to 3% of US medical spending in the last 6 months of life. Maybe it's 5%, maybe if you want a more generous bound. The reason it's not as easy as you think is that we don't know it's the last 6 months of people's life. So the question is not what do we spend the last 6 months of people's life, it's what do we spend on people we know are going to die. That's a tiny number. Tiny, tiny number. In fact, we should spend a lot of money in the last 6 months of their life because the chance it won't be if we do the right thing. But once again, this is the kind of trade-off we have, which is we're going to develop better and better drugs that keep people alive for another week or another month. And the question is, how do we as a society decide to evaluate those versus something like Sovaldi, which keeps you alive for 50 years? And that is something which we don't have which we're looking to institutions like this to try to figure out, is how do we actually evaluate drugs which are keeping you alive another week versus drugs which are keeping you alive 50 years?
Ed Pizzala, I'm a recovering insurance executive, and I work as a consultant to pharmaceutical firms. There's been a number of interesting ideas that have come out of Jonathan Lowe's organization here about how to fund research, and I'm wondering if if you've had an opportunity to give any thought to how we can recycle funding within the healthcare industry. After all, it's an enormous economy all on its own, and whether money that is spent on development can come from someplace so that in part it sort of funds itself later, in part, so that if you and I invest, or if insurance companies invest in these developments, they get a small return afterwards that might offset some of the costs. Is that possible, or is this something where we create some sort of weird loop that isn't going to work out?
Yeah, no, I mean, Andy Lowe's been working a ton on this at the Sloan School, on basically can we use financial market tools to try to resolve the so-called valley of death in drug development. The fact that, so my colleague Heidi Williams has done a fascinating study essentially showing that the private sector won't finance drugs with long development times. The public sector has to finance those because it eats up all your patent time while you're developing if there's no money to be made at the end. And can we use financial private sector tools to fix that? And he's got the Cancer RX initiative, which is trying to do that. I think it's a fascinating issue. I think that it's tricky because they're highly uncorrelated, unpredictable risks. And so putting financial instruments together for these very highly uncorrelated, unpredictable risks are hard. I think the other trick is that I'd only be in favor of it if it comes in the context of a well-regulated system once the drugs exist. Because then once one's hit, all the investors have an incentive to make sure that guy maximizes the money he makes off that drug. So not only do you want to maximize the money you make off the drug, you've got like all the Wall Street guys yelling at you to maximize the money you made off the drug. So we'd have to, I like this I like Andy's idea as sort of a solution to fixing this value of death, but only in context where we've rationalized reimbursement of drugs. Otherwise, it's just going to put even more upward pressure on drug pricing, I think.
Yeah. So to follow on that, if we made more direct government funding or the use of NIH more available in drug development, but tied to that some rules regarding how much the drug can obtain at a price once it reaches the market. Is it possible, do you think, to reduce sort of the risk because we're reducing how much money people have to put into the drug, but at the same time making sure that we don't end up in a situation we have now where an orphan drug costs 14 times what a non-orphan drug costs?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in some sense, this is kind of like a partial pre-commitment contract where you say, look, I'm not going to commit to pay a huge amount, but basically, I will pay more of your R&D costs in return for you controlling the price. And we saw this come up controversially with the Zika vaccine, where the government basically paid the R&D costs and now wants to give sort of monopoly. The Army wanted to give a monopoly contract to one drug company to essentially produce it and make all the money off government-funded R&D. So the opposite of what you want to do. So government funding R&D ought to come with a requirement that there's some social purpose of what's done with it. I think that basically, the big trick is going to be, can we take bold steps on drug pricing? That's what it comes down to politically. And I don't know the answer, but I do know that if we're ever going to crack down on pricing in any sector, it's going to be the drug sector. So I don't know if the government will ever regulate drug pricing, but I do know if they regulate pricing in anything, they're coming for the drugs first. And I think one of the reasons is because people are really upset about all the direct-to-consumer advertising, actually. So the story I always tell about this, which just has the virtue of being true, so I love it, is the story, a pediatrician friend of mine in Lexington, a kid came in his office, a 9-year-old, and said, I'd like to ask you about Cialis. And my pediatrician friend said, really? Why? He said, well, I was watching football, and the TV said to ask my doctor about Cialis. And I think that those ads may be the downfall of the drug industry someday.
Thank you.
John, Ken Oy from MIT.
Yeah.
You were talking about government regulation and pricing. Let me hit you with a question on the effects of competition on pricing. So we're in a situation in this industry, as in many others, where the terms and conditions of licensing have effects on entry. And to what extent should licensing policies take account of competition conditions? Specifically, if you're really interested in bringing down prices, then you'd want to be in a situation where there aren't too many segments where only one product is filling the niche. And to what extent would you favor or oppose taking account of competition conditions and entry conditions in the formulation of licensing policy?
Well, it's really interesting. So I hadn't really thought about that. So your notion is, Ken, is that somehow I would allow a drug once there's two people making it? Is that sort of?
No. Okay, so again, if you're looking at whether superiority is required, for example.
Right.
What if superiority isn't required, equivalence or even near equivalence is required as part of a strategy of putting pressure on markets by getting more products in any given niche? As the definition of niches gets smaller and smaller and smaller, we're likely to be seeing less competition over time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea. I just don't think it's going to work for these specialty drugs. I just don't think, I think it's so expensive to develop these that, you know, once one's developed, it's sort of not worth someone else coming along and developing something that's nearly as good. At least, unless I'm misunderstanding your question, I just don't think that's, I think that's a great avenue for broader conditions, but I think the specialty, you know, narrower drugs are doing, I don't think that's going to do the trick. I don't see a way around regulating their price. I just don't.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hi, Brian Alexander from Dana-Farber. Kind of to your point before about whether information is good or not, what are your views on kind of price transparency for drug prices and the ability of firms to kind of price discriminate? And is there a tension there, and where do you kind of come down on that?
You know, once again, that's only an issue if there's multiple drugs that can treat something. And there, I think price transparency makes sense. I mean, I think when there's multiple drugs, then formula design and price transparency can make a difference, and they should make a difference. I just think that's going to be increasingly not the issue. Increasingly, we're going to have more and more targeted indications where there's not multiple drugs.
So say there's a situation with multiple drugs and maybe not as targeted, but do you think there's a tension between that kind of price transparency and maybe access if you allowed firms to price discriminate maximally?
Yeah, I think so. What kind of price discrimination do you have in mind? Like I guess I don't understand the example.
If a firm could sell to any consumer the price that they could afford.
Yeah, so sort of almost person-specific coupons. I think that, you know, in that case, I think absent affordability concerns, I'm not too worried about that. My concern is more affordability, that it'll make it unaffordable for poor people if they won't get the right coupon. But absent that, I think the advantage of price discrimination is it allows the companies to make the money that promotes drug development. So I'm not too worried about price discrimination among people who can afford the drugs. I'm more worried about how it affects affordability. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, in a way, I was actually thinking about price transparency as lack of price transparency as a way to make it more affordable for people.
Yeah, I guess I don't get that.
Tuitions at universities, where you price discriminate the aid package, right?
I see. So you're basically
So the rich
saying you would
people pay
not
full
let
tuition.
people know what the coupon, you'd set some high price, but then you have sort of person-specific coupons.
Well, we kind of have that now,
Right.
person-specific, but if you made it more person-specific so that so if a person couldn't afford a drug, they actually could afford a drug if you could allow the firm to, you know, charge them. So if I could get $100 from a patient, it's better than, you know, setting the price at $10,000, you're not getting anything, right?
Yeah. Brian's just talking about the way Harvard prices tuition, right? So if you make under $60,000, it's free. If you make $250,000, you pay the $100,000. What if you did drugs the way you do tuition?
I guess, so you're saying that would be less transparent or more transparent?
Well, that's less transparent, but
Right.
but I think that there's always this kind of like panacea of price transparency and how it's all great, but is there a tension in the kind of systems by which we keep some things not transparent?
Yeah, no, I agree. So yes, I agree. I think that given the difficulty of shopping and the hard time consumers have shopping, I think there's an argument against price transparency for the reason you said there. I agree.
So this is just a quick comment. You should look at some of the specialty drugs in cancer. PD-1 inhibitors, for example, cost about $20,000 every 3 weeks as long as they work. They work for lots of different cancers, but a small part of all different cancers. And there are about 3 or 4 or 5 of them approved, and about 5 or 6 or 10 of them still under development, and the price is not coming down.
It's a good point.
And that's only one example of these immune therapies, but in
Right.
cancer specialty drugs, this is true in
Yeah.
CDK4/6, lots of.
Good point. Yeah.
So we'll take these two, and then John's time is about up.
Hi there, Adam Heathwell from Pfizer. I think to the last point, it's very interesting that your description of the incentives leading to essentially dominance in a specialty area and no follow-ons because there's no, that's actually, I think, I'd be really interested what other people see. That's not, tends to be what we see in drug development. You actually see a lot of people piling in behind the same mechanism, in the same indication. Most of the criticisms I've heard, and I've done a lot of work in orphan drugs, is why are you doing another drug in cystic fibrosis? What about this disease, this pediatric population? Why haven't you done this? So I really wonder if you specified the incentives for the industry correctly in your model, if your presumption is what we'll do is develop a specialty drug and then no one else will follow it. I mean, most of the feedback, criticism I've heard as someone who's worked in the industry for just over 10 years is completely the reverse of the description you're saying. There's another problem, which if you have competition, why doesn't it lead to price competition? But actually, I just don't recognize the situation you're describing overall.
Interesting. Yeah, and once again, you would know much better than I. I think my question is, in the future, as you can develop the drug for a particular kind of cancer in a particular kind of population, do you really think that's going to continue? That I'm going to then say, okay, there's a drug for the cancer in that population. It's already got a patent. It's already going ahead. I'm 5 years behind. Am I really going to develop a second drug for that particular cancer in that particular population? Or would I say, well, I'm going to reach this other population that's not covered by that drug, and I'm going to be the first mover? And if that's not happening yet, I don't have a good answer for why. But it just seems like that would be the natural incentives they would face.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, nobody wants to waste their money developing something which isn't any good.
Right.
So either you would look for something which is not well addressed, but you can see, say, in ALK translocation in non-small cell lung cancer, there were some very good drugs, and now there are some amazing drugs.
Right.
But they're fourth or fifth coming through, and you may say, oh, we've got a treatment for this, but you may only get this amount of survival, but if you could get a 95% response rate, that's still worth doing.
Right.
But it's,
okay.
Anyway,
It's interesting. It's a good point. Thank you very much.
I want to focus on the other end of the spectrum, not the million-dollar drugs, but the ones that are virtually free vaccines, and specifically flu vaccines. So if we look at the fact that this year they're estimating a 10% effective flu vaccine, yet it's an $80 billion cost to the system, how do we reconcile within the context we're paying for disease, not for health, not for prevention, yet the value to the system would be enormous if we could get 20% or 50% effective flu vaccines plus protection against a pandemic. So how can you envision, or can we think about the feasibility where system level value, economic value, can be incentivized by all the stakeholders along the continuum?
That's a great question. And it's, once again, you know, I'm out of my expertise in most things I'm talking about, but in particular in this area. And but I do think it seems like that's a natural place where you want one of these, where you want to try to get the stakeholders together to make a commitment contract, which says, you know, we'll pay you a lot of money for the one that's 10% more effective than otherwise. I think the trick is we don't know what the baseline is. I mean, I guess you could say 10%. The problem is that variation varies a lot year to year, right? About how effective it is.
Just 30%. I mean, there's no innovation in this.
Okay, so I think, you know, if the best is 30%, you say, you know, look, someone who can, in some sense, what you really want, right, is dynamic contract, because as it varies year, you want someone who can, over several years, beat 30%. You want someone who sort of consistently can be good. Because the problem is if you say, someone beats 30% one year, someone could get lucky, and you don't want to pay for luck, you want to pay for skill. So I think you want to pay for someone who develops a process where they can systematically beat the market. You want a commitment contract to pay for that, but that turns out to be, that comes back to our financing discussion when Andy Lowe's working on, which is how do you pre-finance that commitment? Now, the easy answer, coming back to politics, is the government does it. Okay? The problem is the government's not very excited about doing things like that right now. So I think we know the easy answer. So for example, you take Hep C. Okay, at any reasonable value of a life, we should just be giving everybody Sovaldi. Okay? The problem is the government won't borrow ahead the money that we need to actually give the people Sovaldi to cure the disease. So we know the right answer. The question is just how to get there politically.
All right. We'll have a round. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You
Can I
sneak
just,
it in.
sorry, can I just question a bit of the last discussion? I come from the biology side, I'm a physician, and you're an economist. And I go to a number of these meetings in Europe, I hear from the public side, we have to steer innovation. You talk about we have to incentivize this development or that development. Now, I'm a bit skeptical about that whole thing. Innovation in the biosciences is opportunistic. Someone finds a molecule that could be a druggable target. It's a tyrosine kinase, or it's TNF, or it's a checkpoint inhibitor. It's one target. Everybody jumps on that. And 5 companies try to develop the same thing for that target. And you can incentivize left, right, and center. There isn't anything else that they could develop. So are we overestimating the ability of the system to incentivize in this or that direction? I do buy it when it comes to the neglected diseases. So no one would want to invest in something that only occurs somewhere in the poorest zones of Africa, fine. But when we look at Alzheimer's, cancer, autoimmune diseases, I think your ability to incentivize or disincentivize are very, very limited. It's driven by basic science discoveries, and there are very few and far between those.
So I think that's an excellent point, and it brings us 2 points. One is that the basic research is the public good here, and that we do too little of it. That basically the basic research that helps us figure out what molecules do what, and then so they know what to target, that's the limited resource. The second point you're making, though, is sort of related to something I said, which is we don't have to worry about incentivizing the broad things, the lists on the autoimmune diseases, et cetera. It's the more specific targeted solutions, as well as the neglected, like the flu vaccine. The more specific targeted things where the question is, if I'm a drug company and I am only going to develop this orphan drug, which affects 1,000 people, if I can make an enormous amount of money off it. Now, today I can. The question is, in a world of more regulated drug prices, will I then say, so basically ask pharma about drug price regulation, their answer is, well, we won't innovate then. The question is, can you have your cake and eat it too, by saying, we will help do research along that direction in return for a limited price on that orphan drug. So like when the market's thin, there can be incentive and there can be directionalized incentives, but not for broad markets. I agree.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks for making so much time for the discussion, because that was really the most fun out of the whole thing. So thanks a lot for that.